I wanted to do something a little bit different than what I usually do. It's a book that I had to read during my master's degree program, and it has to deal with a topic that is relevant today: the Civil War statues and commemoration. I understand a lot of these statues were put up much later, about 20 to 40 years after the Civil War, by certain groups that wanted to commemorate the, dare I say, the Confederate side. And there's many different memorials for it. So let me read this real quick. This is a book by Thomas J. Brown. Let's get it closer. And it's called The Public Art of Civil War Commemoration, A Brief History with Documents. I want to read this one part real quick in here. It's on page 3. It says, Phases of Civil War Commemoration. This might give some context, okay? Because a lot of times, tear down monuments. Why? Because racist. Because reasons. Okay? Understand that a lot of this stuff is art. You may not agree with it, and a lot of them I don't agree with it myself. However, this shows a part of our history, part of our past in the United States, to where we should recognize and we should study, we should acknowledge. We shouldn't just tear it down and burn it at the stake like some of you French revolutionists out there want to do. So, come here. I'm going to read this. This book presents 5 case studies in Civil War remembrance, examining tributes to citizen soldier, women of war, Robert E. Lee, and the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, and Abraham Lincoln. Each chapter traces the development of commemoration from the war years to the present. These trajectories are partly distinctive to the separate topics, but they also reflect broader patterns of periodization defined by shifts in the apparatus that has produced Civil War memory, as well as shifts in the ideas that Americans have found compelling in their recollections of the war. No one who's in the United States right now has been alive since the Civil War. Now, people can argue that we're in a civil war right now, maybe a soft one, but the thing is that we need to recognize this. It's good for history. The links between sponsorship and content in the commemoration were particularly evident in the efforts of political parties to tap Civil War memory during the generation after Appomattox. For the younger folks out there who don't know what Appomattox is, that's where the Civil War officially, technically ended. Now, it did go on continue on a month later, maybe, perhaps. But that's when Robert E. Lee surrendered the Union, or the Army of Northern Virginia, to Ulysses S. Grant and the North, etc., etc., etc. Even as he moved away from the focus on issue of slavery and freedom that had given birth to the party, Republicans were quick to remind voters that they had led the successful defense of the Union, a strategy that Democrats labeled waving the bloody shirt. You see, understand that a lot of these monuments that were put up, it was part of reconciliation. Why are there so many Confederate generals whose names are attached to U.S. military bases? That was part of reconciliation. That's all. It's not they're trying to glorify them. They're trying to say, okay, yeah, these people existed. And they fought for a losing side, but nonetheless, they were still Americans, even though they broke away. And well after that theme faded, Republicans sought to enhance and benefit from the popularity of Lincoln. Southern Democrats, in turn, relied heavily on their identification with the Confederacy. Notice how I just said there. Southern Democrats, in turn, relied heavily on their identification with the Confederacy. Rebel veterans comprised more than 70% of the members of the 45th Congress, 1877 to 1879, from the former Confederate states, and almost 50% of the Southern delegation as late as the 54th Congress, 1895 to 1897. Veterans groups initially formed to combine partnerships with remembrance of the ordeal of warfare. I hate to have to mention this group because it's in the book. The Ku Klux Klan, established by former Confederate soldiers in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866, perpetrated extra-legal political violence in hooded costumes intended to identify Klan members with the ghosts of the fallen comrades. There you go, folks. The Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, a society for Union veterans founded in Decatur, Illinois in April 1866, did not share the sinister aspects of the Klan, but also recalled the traumatic experiences of frontline troops and dedicated itself to political action, rallying behind the leadership of former Union General John A. Logan. In the 1880s, however, the GAR developed into a fraternal organization with broader membership and less partisan ideological agenda. By 1890, the organization boasted more than 350,000 members in local posts around the country, over one-third of the surviving Union veterans. The counterpart, Union Confederate Veterans, formed in 1889. 15 years later, it claimed 1,565 local camps and total membership of approximately 80,000. Estimated to be between one-third and one-fourth of the surviving Confederate veterans. Many of the Civil War armies and regiments also had active alumni societies. These organizations faded away as the ex-soldiers died, although the UCV fostered the formation in 1896 of a successor organization, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, which had 16,000 members in 1903. Okay. So not all people who wanted to commemorate on the Confederate side were evil. Some of them were just veterans. Okay? Now, I know a lot of people right now want to pin them as evil people. But let's face it though. When the war broke out in 1861, no one was really an American. If you were born in Virginia, you were a Virginian. If you were born in Massachusetts, or if you lived in Boston, you're a Bostonian. If you lived in Illinois, you're from Illinois. If you're of Georgia, you're a Georgian, etc. So you weren't really an American. You identified with your state or even your city more than anything. The evolution of women's commemorative groups similarly illustrated the late 19th century shift in the Civil War memory. Ladies' memorial associations formed communities throughout the South shortly after the war to attend the final disposition of soldiers' remains and sponsor mourning ceremonies and monuments. The establishment of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1894 created an organizational structure beyond the local level and sustained commemoration as an everyday social activity rather than a series of isolated projects like reinterments or annual Memorial Day observances. So back then Memorial Day was for both sides. Even though the war was over for decades, people still, look back on it and remembered what happened, for good and the bad. The UDC grew rapidly to include 138 local chapters within 3 years and almost 100,000 members by World War I. Its northern counterpart was the Women's Relief Corps, which formed in 1883 when the GAR invited a Massachusetts coalition of veterans aid societies to create a national commemorative body. The group numbered more than 100,000 members from 1892 to 1919. Popular magazines demonstrate the expansion of the market Civil War remembrance in the 1880s. After responding to the intense national absorption in the war as it unfolded, publishers had retreated somewhat from the topic during the 1870s. Harper's Weekly and Harper's Monthly, which published more than 200 short stories about the war by 1865, largely stopped carrying war fiction. A revival blossomed with the appearance of a series of war reminiscences. In Century magazine from November 1884 to November 1887. It helped increase circulation from 127,000 to 225,000 in the first 6 months, provided the basis for a successful 4-volume collection of memoirs. Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, 1888. The reinvigorated reading market for Civil War memory was even sufficient to support magazines devoted exclusively to it. Confederate Veteran, 1893 to 1932, boasted a peak circulation of 20,000 at the turn of the century. Popular magazines, moreover, were only one example of the convergence between remembrance and entrepreneurship. Railroads and merchants encouraged veterans, reunions, the development of the battlefield park shared in the growth of the tourism industry, and printmakers sought to stimulate consumer demand for images associated with the war. So, Think about this. I remember in the 80s, there was a lot of Vietnam War movies. That's sort of what was going on. So you had people sort of reflecting back on it and people asking questions. Hey, what went on? People who weren't even born or even were very young during the time, during the Civil War. So you had people wanting to know about it, wanted to read stories. Maybe not necessarily glorify it, but that's what you could probably say. They were sort of glorifying what was going on. Even on both sides, if you will. The book devotes special attention to public monuments, a cultural forum that was at the peak of its popularity in the period of from the 1850s through the phase of the Civil War commemoration that began in the 1880s. Again, a lot of these monuments were brought up around 1880-ish to like 1920, okay, in the South and some other western and northern states. The war was by far the most frequently represented historical subject in the thousands of monuments Americans dedicated before the form fell from favor during the 1920s. These works frequently served as focal points for contests over memory of the war, for the construction of a monument is a political process that routinely requires sponsors to obtain public space, agree on a design, and raise funds. Like other political processes, memorial projects have reflected the distribution of power within the United States. Monuments often purport to stand the shared views of a community that in fact is divided, and the sense that they offer only a limited record of American memory of the Civil War. But memorials are not merely permanent images of temporary dominant viewpoints. They are sites of negotiation among different ideological positions, both within the sponsoring group and outside of it. Those negotiations have often continued well after the dedication ceremony, for the monument is a product not only of the period in which it is installed, but also of the constantly changing civic landscape. Let me read that again, because that is extremely important when we're talking about this. But memorials are not merely permanent images of temporary dominant viewpoints. They are sites of negotiation among different ideological positions, both within the sponsoring group and outside of it. Those negotiations have often continued well after dedication ceremony, for the monument is a product not only of the period in which it was installed, but also constantly changing civic landscape. Understand that even though we have a monument of Robert E. Lee, okay, well, I think it's getting torn down in Virginia, in Richmond. Even though that was it, there was a monument there. Things have changed. Now, if they voted to take it down, fine, whatever. But are we rewriting history? Are we just trying to get rid of it, trying to ignore it, and just leave it for books and, different, and making sure that when we talk about it, it's by some sort of liberal, far leftist teacher who just wants to condemn Robert E. Lee? By the way, Robert E. Lee was an engineer in the U.S. Army before he defected essentially to the Confederate Army. He was a war hero during the Mexican-American War, fought alongside both sides of the war of generals, and considered, he was a slave owner, much like a lot of people in the South were. And yes, even Ulysses S. Grant, who, by the way, was willed a slave, and he released him a year later. So we got to take his statue down? I mean, do we see what's going on here? It's just that everyone's wrapped up in the moment. Everyone's, tear it down. Why? Should we tear down Planned Parenthood because it was founded by a racist eugenicist, Margaret Sanger? Should we do that? Oh no, you're going too far. Am I? Am I going too far? No. Its meaning may be adjusted by ceremonies held at the site, embellishment of the surrounding area, or literary depictions. At once, the most solidly fixed and most open-ended form of remembrance, a public monument connects Civil War commemoration in the past and the present. I think I'll finish up here. The decline in commission of public monuments during the 1920s partly reflected technological innovations that affected mechanisms of the Civil War remembrance. Monuments tended to be obstacles for rapidly proliferating automobiles which gave rise to new forms of commemoration like highways named after Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis. Are we going to start renaming highways now? Even more significant for American memory was the rise of motion picture industry, such film as Birth of a Nation. That's another topic for another video. Guess where that film was launched in or played in? Guess what really important house that may have been white held by Woodrow Wilson? Yeah. That's an interesting story. Gone with the Wind. I can't have Gone with the Wind anymore, right? Young Mr. Lincoln and Abe Lincoln in Illinois in some ways amassed cultural role of public monument. The movies, however, did so in a very different form that reshaped commemoration at the same time that the intellectual attitudes of World War I era were challenging the Victorian context of the previous Civil War remembrance. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that trying to deface the Shaw 54th Regiment Memorial during the protest. Why? Shaw led a contingent of volunteered black soldiers during the Civil War and fought pretty damn hard. If you watch that movie Glory, pretty good movie. It was damaged, but not only has it been damaged in 2020, it's also been damaged with paint in 2012. A sword was broken off in 2015 and 2017. Yeah, so people are like, oh, it didn't really get damaged. Really? It did. This is the monument right here for they were refurbishing it. This is a good story, and this actually talks about it in the book right here. Why is this not showing up? Okay, it is showing up. Anyways, so this monument right here, you got Shaw here on this horse, and you have all the black soldiers right there from Massachusetts marching with him. And you got a lady up here. I don't really understand what the context of the lady is, but I'll do a video on that because it's pretty interesting. This whole monument took 15, 20 years to make, I think. It wasn't overnight because there was also a lot of debate on like, well, it's ugly, doesn't make any sense, etc. So, but the point being here now is that we're living in a time where we have a mob, a very small percentage of the population, the mob, trying to tear down monuments. Now, I can possibly stand with you, say, well, we need to get Robert E. Lee because... All right, but you know what? That is for Virginia and Richmond, Virginia, to decide. The people of Virginia, that's for them to decide. If they want to tear it down, knock it out. But it shouldn't be people from Massachusetts rolling down there in an angry mob with pitchforks and torches trying to tear down monuments. Because it's a reflection on what happened in the past and attitudes. So we're just going to get rid of it? Because if we're going to do that, you might as well tear down Mount Rushmore. And you might as well tear down every single monument statue ever, because no one is perfect. And you know what? These people want to tear down these statues and monuments. That's fine. But let me ask you a question. Are you perfect? Are you better than them? I'm going to say probably not.